move back to Irina and just see, the clear connections there, I think, between what Magnus talked about and what you were talking about. And as I said at the outset, this is maybe about both positive and negative aspects of this, the questions about whether or not these technologies can lead to less reliable data and maybe less reliable science in the longer term. But also, how do we gain advantage from them? There are, I think, new approaches, new possibilities with AI technology. And I think Magnus is quite right to say we need to look beyond the technologies that are in the spotlight at the moment, the generative AI, large language models, and so on. There are many other technologies which can be combined together. It's one of the things that I find confusing and interesting sometimes is when people talk about AI, we're using AI for this, we're using AI for that. I go, what exactly are you using? Are you just slapping that label on it? Anyway, Irina, what are your thoughts to the range of questions that Magnus has asked there?
Thank you. So I believe on the one hand, when we talk about AI, we may mean different things. In my talk, I have pointed out that the scientific workflow is a very complex process. So there are many steps. And each of the steps may or may not be supported by AI or also executed by AI. As I said, the human and AI skills may be highly complementary, right? So we also use search engines since 20 years, right? And it's also AI in a sense, right? But we have learned how we trust it. When I started my scientific career, some researchers from social sciences claimed that this will lead to de-skilling people not able to navigate the information. This did not happen. We adapted. So I think that humans will adapt. And it's not about still finding a role for the human. I think that human will remain very crucial, but the role of the human will shift more to a verifier, co-constructor, and the entity who assumes accountability for the outcome. So this is one point. Another point, in talking about science, we tend to generalize, but science is multi-discipline enterprise, okay? And natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, they use different scientific paradigms, different methodologies. And I think this is going to make a huge difference in how AI is used because there might be overlapping steps in these scientific workflows, but there are also quite different steps. And therefore, it's hard to generalize, right? So in my field, machine learning, natural language processing, the scientific process is more empirical and highly standardized in a sense, right? So usually the papers will follow specific templates. That's why it might be easier to automate than humanities, where each artifact is highly creative. And the diversity of outputs is much higher. However, in my field, there are other challenges like mathematical reasoning, for example, and empirical research design, related reasoning, and things like that. So different disciplines will have different challenges and will need different types of technological solutions. And the last point I'd like to highlight, not mentioned in my talk, but when we talk about human-based science, we assume a perfect world. In recent years, I think it's common knowledge that this world is far from being perfect. Maybe it's perfect in some other disciplines, but not in mine. And science is in a crisis. I work a lot on AI-supported peer review, and humans are actually quite a bad model on average for a good peer review because the average quality is low. So this has something to do with the explosion of the community size and skewed demographics towards specific populations of inexperienced reviewers. And here I think AI can can be a big facilitator, in how to raise actually the quality of the human process. And as I thought, as I said, like my claim is that the truth is in this human AI collaboration where AI adapts to a human. So human is not equal to human, right? So there's a big difference between experienced humans and the beginners. They need different types of support. And therefore, AI needs to be equipped with the capability to adapt to the user and be fine-tuned on guiding the user in their reasoning process if they are a beginner, for example. While if the user is an experienced researcher, the type of support needed is maybe mainly in facilitating routine work and saving a lot of time on that. For example, monitoring the huge space of current literature related to a specific question. Yeah, so this is what I think currently.
Thanks very much, Irina. Magnus, does that allay any of your concerns about the long-term data fidelity? Do you think that AI, for example, the idea of peer review that is supported by AI, do you think that can make things better in the longer term?
No, absolutely. And I mean, you're absolutely right, Irina. Right? This AI is a tool, and humans are not perfect. And I think we need to acknowledge that. Now, I think that the question is indeed also how do we relate to this technology as a society? What kind of trust do we put in it? I loved your reference there to search and how we overcame some of the skepticism and fears of humans becoming redundant because search was so good, and I think we'll face a similar moment in how we apply different types of AI. Now, I think the question is still around data fidelity and that kind of generation process, and we might end up with better data, and I think synthetic data also has a role. Let's not forget. I mean, I think that there's always a danger in overcorrecting as well. So, if we talk about synthetic data and the role that AI has as powerful and almost accurate, it's quite driven by rules so far, particularly LLMs and generative AI. So how do we put that to good use without losing anything? I think synthetic data is a good example of something that can be put to good use in plugging gaps, completing data sets, etc. I just think we need to label so that or find a metadata format or some kind of wilderness for data so that we know what was there from the beginning and what's been backfilled to help science, to help research, to help modeling by plugging the gaps. So absolutely, I think your point there, Rena. I think that the thing, and I also spend a lot of time looking at skills, looking at the general program, workforce, etc. We need to find a way also as when we're talking to commercial actors to make sure that we don't lose that experience production, and that we don't end up putting so much trust in AI that we forget to train people to help them reason, to help them gain the expertise to do the triage of the AI output so that we can know what's good and bad. I think that's still a work in progress. We haven't figured out the solution, but it's something to not lose sight of at this crucial stage, because when you look at the layoffs in big companies, you look at the approach of some companies to almost replace their junior humans with AI. Those effects will linger in society for a long time. So important point to dwell on maybe for a bit when we talk about governance and when we talk about how we relate to AI as both as a society, but also in terms of producing that expertise that ultimately drives science and humanities and education. I have a 16-year-old son, so I'm very much at the at the cusp of trying to figure that out from a human perspective. But but they're big questions, right? What's the role of education, structured education as we have it? What's the role of skills-based learning? What's the role of the uh, replacement of some of those skills with AI? And where does that buck stop?
And I might pick up on that last question, Magnus, and maybe reframe it a little bit for Irina to comment on. So one of the things that Arisa was talking about was the role of academia and the role of academia as being an independent or a separate place where there is maybe more scope for objective research and so on. And Irina, so one of the things that Magnus talked about there was ensuring that the public interest doesn't get lost sight of here, and how do we ensure that research efforts are not always chasing corporate or profit-based priorities. And I just wonder if you'd have any thoughts on that from the perspective of someone who's an active researcher in a technological space.
I think we need to define what is public interest. In computer science, we optimize for certain objective, and if the objective is not clearly defined, it's hard to optimize for this objective. I think what the industry is doing is in public interest because it's contributing to the development of the society in general. However, the types of research that were originally done in universities have changed, right? So a lot of research on large models is shifted to companies because the universities are not well equipped to keep the pace. However, there are also many counter efforts, right? So this field is very volatile and is changing very rapidly. And right now it's a bit chaotic because it's hard to also compare all these developments. Evaluation is a very hard research problem. Many things are claimed by companies in blocks. However, these claims do not undergo scientific peer review process. So in many cases, they exaggerate it, and it's hard to see for somebody not trained in this specific area. So there's a lot of misleading information. And I think an important priority for the society is how to establish more understanding of this area and more principled evaluation, which is hard because we don't know actually how to evaluate. Evaluation with humans is very subjective. It's not reproducible. And especially in expert domains, the time of experts is extremely expensive and they're not much willing to spend their time on continuously evaluating tools, right? So there are many open challenges, safety being one of them, which is crucial. Also the dual use aspect. All these technologies have a heavy dual use aspect. So there is need for regulation. And this is across the whole world. While the cultures and the values in the world are not unified, as we all know, right? So that's why it's also hard to establish regulation based on different underlying values. I think there are many challenges to be addressed. Also, the social sciences research is extremely important in order to approach them in a principled and scientific manner.
Thank you, Irina. So if there's anybody in the audience who has any questions or anything to contribute, by all means, feel free to speak up or raise your hand or put a message in the chat. But I wanted to pick up just on another aspect of what you said there, Irina. This is a question for both of you, I think, because it connects with what both of you have talked about. So peer review is difficult and challenging, and scientific research is also can be difficult and challenging. And I think Magnus is right to point out that the priorities don't necessarily follow the greater social good, or if they do, they may leave out people who should be considered in some way. To what extent does AI provide an opportunity for a more democratic or open use of science? Can it open up access to avenues of research to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to engage in it, so that there is scope for example, sufferers from a rare disease to fund research that to help deal with their issues. Is there more scope for researchers in the humanities to do things that otherwise would not be possible without access to a university, for example? What are the possibilities for more bottom-up research, I suppose, is what I'm asking in with AI support.
Magnus, would you like to go first this time?
I can certainly have a go at this one, and I think you're absolutely right, Irina, to define precisely the public interest and acknowledging the cultural societal difference that we have across the world. I mean, this is a perennial problem and endemic a little bit everywhere. So that's a very very important point to make. What is a public good? What are we trying to solve for here, right? What's the problem definition? Now, I think to your point about can we use AI to make research science more democratic? Ronan, I think you're absolutely right. The challenge here that I see in conversations with clients and other parties on the commercial sphere is around intellectual property eventually, right? Because patenting, copywriting, willingness to open data, and we've seen this for more than a decade in the EU, certainly around open data, open access, open coding as well. I mean, the way that we develop, you know, open source code versus closed. So I think that the what I'm trying to get to is the commercial lead driven sphere will always want to protect its own secrets, its own advantage, its own particularly in a fast moving space like this, its own access to market. And I like to maybe reference something that Nicholas Enstrom, who's famously founded Skype many years ago and is now a VC. It's not necessarily about first to market; it's about first to trust. And if you capture the market in the sense that people can trust what you're doing, then you have a very different proposition than if you're just trying to move fast and break things. And I like that. Maybe it's a European way of framing it, but it also taps into that openness framing that you put there, Ron, which is how much of the innovations in the research, the knowledge that's being built up, should we, with various governance tools, help open up and make more democratic and more accessible, and that we don't end up all of the key the key value that's being driven by AI accumulating in the hands of a few that allows them to exploit it. I think the democracy aspect there is super important, and we have tools for that. I think we have models for that, certainly in the software space, and elsewhere about how we open up data and knowledge, etc. Also in the science sphere, in publications, how do you fund research? How do you make sure that innovation is rewarded, etc. So there's a lot to build on. I think we just need to find a way to put a lens on AI and the various types of AI, so that we move that discussion forward, and we don't lose momentum, because it is moving fast, and we don't want to end up in a situation where it's very hard to reverse these processes. So that would be my first thought. But Irina, and you know a lot more about this than me, so I'll be quiet for a bit.
Yeah, maybe I focus on peer review, since scientific quality control is at the core of the scientific process. And here I am very convinced that AI has a huge potential for democratization of scientific process, and also for serving minorities and underrepresented groups. So I see two major lines of democratization. So one of them is availability of automatic peer review 24/7 to anybody before or while they prepare a scientific manuscript. While we, of course, know that this peer review is not perfect, but the technology is getting better as we speak. It's developing very fast. So that was one of my points in the pitch, that the speed of development is really mind-blowing. And also, already now we know in which steps AI is particularly good. So people can make use or can benefit of these specific steps of the AI-based peer review. And this is basically a training tool that people can use, especially people who do not have access to high quality expertise, like world-class research lab, high quality supervision, and all of this. So this is one direction. Another direction is, I think AI is in a sense like very complementary to humans in peer review, because AI is able to read all existing literature, so it can capture the background of a given research paper very, very well. And this is not feasible for human reviewers. We see in our research and studies that human reviews are crucially conditioned on human background knowledge in a given specific topic. And humans have limited time to extend their background knowledge by doing a lot of background research, comprehending the literature, and so on. And so the resulting human reviews may be very specific about particular human perspective on this work. And that's why there is so little statistical agreement among human reviewers. In our study, we have a very interesting finding that AI has higher agreement with every human reviewer than these human reviewers among each other. And here I also see a big potential for democratization, because AI is able to provide more consistent reviews for a big variety of papers, giving all the noise in human reviews. Actually, I recently started to claim, because there's a big debate, should AI be used as part of peer review or not? Some big communities with flagship conferences like AAAI, for example, used a fourth complementary AI, a fully AI generated review in addition to 3 traditional human reviews, right? So there are like camps for and against. But from my perspective, I don't actually care if the review comes from a human, from a machine, or a combination of both, which I claim is the future. What I care about is the quality of the review I get, right? And here, I think the challenges are similar. We don't know how to measure the quality of human reviews, and we also don't know how to measure the quality of automatic reviews. And this is something that we need to focus our research efforts on. As I said, if we don't have the objective to optimize for, we cannot really advance the technology to meet our expectations.
Thank you, Irina. So I wanted to pick up on a little part of what Magnus talked about there, which was the question of trust. You had a quote there, Magnus, that I really liked, about not necessarily being first to market, but first to trust. That was it. And it occurred to me that there might be some important lessons that we can learn and apply, perhaps with regard to AI governance, from the long story of, well, I suppose it's long if you're living in it. It's short in terms of human history, but of the last 25 or 30 years, maybe, of internet and technology governance, because it seems to me that a lot of that has been actually a story in which trust has been eroded. I'm old enough to remember the early days of the internet, and it seemed quite a positive space. And I think there were a lot of utopian ideals around then, which a lot of whom didn't really come to pass or didn't come to fruition. I don't know that was necessary. I think that there's a combination of intersections between market forces and regulatory forces that led to what we have now. But now I think that there is I would say, a fair amount of distrust of technology, particularly of big tech. We've talked, you hear talk of things like the techlash, where the public and politicians have sometimes turned against technology. You see new types of technologies like cryptocurrency, which were uh, came forward as being, opening up new possibilities. And certainly, I think that they have some applications, but there has been a lot of misuse and abuse and scams that have been fueled by cryptocurrency as well. Um, so just focusing in on that question of trust, which I think also runs through a lot of what Irina's been talking about. I just wonder if what reflections both of you might have on, as I say, looking back over the last 25 or 30 years, what we might take as things to do or things not to do as we move into the next 25 or 30 years with AI.
I can maybe kick that off, and I love your reference point there, Ron. I think the internet governance framework that evolved from a clean slate almost, right? Has been impressive. It's a multi-stakeholder model. It's technically uh, based, and I think there's a lot we can learn about how we handle AI from a governance perspective in that, because without the multi-stakeholder approach that the internet was built on, I think governments would have made a lot of wrong calls because of the zeitgeist, because of lack of technical knowledge, because of political interference, etc. That would have basically killed the internet in its infancy. So I think the way that the technical nature of AI and where it's heading, I think almost calls for a similar model to emerge somewhere. Now, whether we're in the same utopian mindset as we were in the early days of the internet is an open question. I'm not sure we can make that claim, but because it's there, and the internet governance model is kind of well understood. It's embedded. It has a structure. There's probably ways to iterate it and improve on it for 2025, as opposed to the 90s or the early days of the internet, which also goes for government regulation or policy based intervention in the way that things are shaped. So I think absolutely. Now I think the challenge with a multi-stakeholder model is indeed, and you were right to point it out from the start, Ronan, trust. How do you create that governance model that does not give a sense from the public at large, from the various communities involved, that is skewed, that is favoring one set of interests, or is easy to bend in favor of one particular stakeholder, and that is really where I think the internet governance model has a robust track record, and we can build something from that, whether or not, because it requires everyone to pull in the same direction. Whether or not we can actually pull it off for AI, different story. But absolutely, I think the internet has a lot of things to teach us, and because it's been going on for a long time, we have a kind of institutional memory of how it worked and what can be improved on.
Thanks very much, Magnus. Irina, what are your thoughts on internet governance and what we can learn from it?
Yeah, my core expertise is more in the technical domain, how to establish trust by technical means. This is something I'm comfortable to talk about. And I'd like to highlight that this issue is kind of one of the central research directions in the development of large language models. There are research fields that study uncertainty quantification to inform the user about how certain specific outputs. Recently, there is a new development. There is a new model, Gemma Vault, which is giving some privacy guarantees on the output that can help establish trust of the users on the output generated by a large language model. And there are techniques called source attribution, where the user has better means to fact check the content output by the large language model. So a lot of work in my community is along these lines, also how to align the models with human values and with the cultural values. Another area I've been working on quite extensively is this framework of human AI collaboration. And for the more technical audience present today, it's a neuro symbolic approach. So basically, we have an explicit construction space of potential solutions to the expert problem where the human and agent jointly co-construct the solutions by using natural language dialogue. And this framework is by definition is giving a like accountability of the solution, because at every step the human can control the output and the partial solution proposed, and also can interact with the large language model in order to improve the solution and align the solution with the expert preference. And finally, beyond the technical perspective, I think crucial is the social dimension, literacy that we have seen, for example, related to Wikipedia in the past. It has emerged as a crowd-based resource, and initially there were very big concerns about using this in schools or in scientific work. However, after some time, we have developed understanding of this collaboratively constructed knowledge, and we have developed actionable guidelines. And this was put in school education, teaching children how to assess the quality of this source and how to verify information. And now we can cite this, right? But we are aware that, of course, this information may contain certain amount of noise. And I think the direction that the society should take related to generative AI is develop this understanding related, and based on this, develop guidelines and bring this to early education. This is already happening in some parts of the world. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, they start already in primary school in teaching children using these technologies, right? Of course, I'm not an educational specialist, and we can debate, if this is the right age and the right approach, but I do think that this is the right direction. And this is something that educational researchers can look into, how to equip humans with the skills that are necessary in order to benefit from all of these technologies.
Very good. Thank you, Irina. Your mention of Wikipedia sort of brings up the next thing I wanted to talk about, because I think one of the things that's interesting when you look back at the history of the internet, particularly, and of some other aspects of the early development of computer technology, is the question of openness. A lot of the success of the internet was built on the fact that the underlying technologies were, to some extent, freely available or freely reusable, or people can build on them. So we had open standards, we had open source software, and so on. And Magnus, I'll start with you, I think, particularly here, because I know you have an interest in questions around infrastructure, which I think is really where this is going. So what are your thoughts on the role of openness in ensuring that AI can be more of a positive thing? And where do you see the long-term sort of infrastructure contributions here?
I think that's a really nice nuance. Thanks, Ronan, for bringing that up. And I think there's a lot that can be said about openness in the knowledge space, but I think the infrastructure is key here. And I think again the risk of concentration of the infrastructure that's needed for a lot of the AI development that we're talking about to materialize, if that's concentrated in the hands of a few commercial players, that is a real risk. And I think we are seeing a lot of understanding and acknowledgement movement in a good direction, I think, in terms of the public sector. investing in things like AI gigafactories and in storage and in the hardware, right? That's needed to power all this. But then it goes back to your question: what's the access model? How open is it? How expensive is it? Can it compete with, or can it correspond to what's available commercially? And does it need to? So I think all these are, is the money well spent, basically, if you're investing in something from the public sphere. Of course, I think there's no question in my mind that if the public sector invests in infrastructure for this purpose, that it needs to be open, it should be open. But there is a constraint, and this infrastructure is nowhere near the scale of the commercial investments. It's nowhere near often the cutting edge because these approving, building, etc. takes a lot of time. So you always have a bottleneck in these so-called open or infrastructures designed to be open for these kind of purposes. Um, so how do you correct for that? I don't know. I mean, you can always map out where the border is between what's commercially available, affordable, and what the conditions are on that, and try to plug the gap, do that gap analysis. But it boils down to the fact that without the infrastructure, a lot of what we're talking about now is moot. We won't be having this discussion, and there is a danger that I think if you move too far from acknowledging this issue, you end up with with a real gap that's, again, very difficult to close because these things take a lot of time to catch up with. So the question is more, it's not a black and white one, I think, about openness or closed. I think each one has its value, its role in the system, but when it comes to certainly public investment and the types of open infrastructures out there, the conditions and the volume, the capacity, the scale at which you invest in these complementary infrastructures will have a big impact on, who can use them and who's front of the queue, as it were, when it comes to doing a triage of who gets access and when. But I don't know, Irina, you probably have more direct experience of accessing infrastructures needed for your research, etc.
Thank you. So I actually have two perspectives. So one is a natural language processing researcher, and the other is the user of large language models. From the perspective as a researcher, I think it's extremely important to define what is open source here. So we talk about open weight models, and from the perspective of research, it's important to know which data the model has been trained on. So the transparency of the data set. And we do have some great developments in my community. For example, there's the Olmo model from Allen AI in the United States, where we can transparently access the data and the weights. And there are other efforts like PTIA, for example, that provide different checkpoints during the model training. So all these are great developments to enable reproducible research. This is extremely important, and interpretability of large language models is an area which is growing very fast. There's a special research priority program being established right now in Germany, for example, which is concerned with understanding the fundamental mechanism behind large language models. And for us, it's important to have access to such open models in the sense that their weights are open, they have different checkpoints, and also the training data is open. So this is not necessarily having the infrastructure to train our own big models. So in our experiments, we often have more restricted artificial setups where we investigate the learning mechanism of the large language model. So this is the perspective of researcher. As the user of large language models, Yeah, I think there is a big shift, and I wonder if the claim made by Magnus that the infrastructure is restricted in access to a few commercial players is still kind of true nowadays. What we see is a shift because in China, a lot of models are great models, very high quality models are open weight, right? And they are widely accessible, different from like other companies who close the access and actually even do not publish on this topic and so on. So there's some geopolitical development, and I think behind this there are certain strategies of occupying the market. Nevertheless, I think that investing in infrastructure for AI is extremely important, and unfortunately, the level of investment is hugely different in different geographical regions of the world. And I think Europe has a lot of homework to do here because there are also not only US and China, but also in the Gulf region. I'm an affiliated professor at MBZ which is a new University of Artificial Intelligence in Abu Dhabi. So there's a huge investment in these technologies. And I think it's very important for Europe to be part of this game, right? And not restricting the role to regulation, which is currently, I think, the kind of division of labor that we have.
Thanks very much, Rena. I wanted to ask a sort of related question on infrastructure with regard to the long-term viability of AI as a tool that's part of the research process, whether it's the creation of the output or the peer review or all the different roles that it can take in this. And again, that's looking back at the history of technology and the internet. We've seen booms and crashes in that. And I don't want this to turn into a conversation about whether or not there is an AI crash coming, but it's certainly part of the conversation at the moment, that there is a huge investment in some of these private companies and that some of them may be overvalued. So, who knows what we might be talking about in 6 months or a year in that context. But one of the things that I'm curious about, and Irina, this may be a question for you initially, as you're the more technical person here. The dot-com crash was economically quite damaging and caused a lot of hardship for a lot of people. But one perhaps positive outcome from it in the long run was that it left behind a lot of physical infrastructure that could be used for other things. A lot of what we're seeing now, both in terms of online technologies and e-commerce and media and so on, streaming is built on the tech that was the groundwork that was first laid down then. If we have an AI crash, are we going to be left with useful infrastructure, or does that question of openness mean that so much of it is going to be tied up in IP rights by major corporations and possibly also left behind by technology? Because I appreciate that cabling gets better, but an old cable still works, if you know what I mean. Whereas an old large language model maybe isn't as useful. I'm not sure. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, even as a more technical person today, I cannot predict the future. So
Mm-hmm.
first of all, I don't think there will be AI crash. I think the expectation towards AI may change over time because we better understand the capabilities of this technology and the point of infrastructure getting outdated. I think in computer science, it's something that we almost assume that we need to change the infrastructure on average every 5 years. And I have seen several paradigm shifts over my scientific career. Of course, the type of infrastructure we are talking about is particularly expensive, but this is nothing which is unusual in other fields of science. For example, in physics, they need very expensive infrastructure to be able to conduct certain types of work, right? So, and I think we need just to accept this fact that the technology might change. There is also a lot of work on efficient machine learning, which can change the game in future by making the learning process much more efficient and not dependent on these very expensive infrastructures, right? But this is something that the time is going to show. And related to this question, so I recall just a few days ago, I read some article that actually, like, there are a lot of claims how AI can be useful. And in this session, we talk about how it can be useful in science, but there is very little evidence how useful it is actually after it has been deployed in a real expert process, right? So there is almost no evidence for that. There are some studies that are circulated. I don't know if they are like scientifically valid, but just a few days ago, I've seen that a study about a tool called just for coding, a
Hmm.
cursor, right? So cursor is a popular framework for code generation that is basically to support software developers and replace all these entry level jobs, right? And there has been a study investigated long-term effects, and the study has shown that long-term, the cost incurred by using AI is actually higher than not using AI because though it can produce the code of simple tasks very efficiently, but the really expensive thing is verifying this code and maintaining this code, debugging this code, and this incurs huge cost over time, right? So I think this is something that people in maybe psychology of work and human computer interaction need to study. And it's very difficult because, I mean, the technology is very new and basically it's changing as we speak every day. So it's hard to produce reliable scientific evidence. But I think we do need these kind of studies to have a better orientation in the space of possible options, how to actually deploy the technology in real life, expert-based processes where the failure to deploy it effectively costs a huge amount of money.
Thanks, Irina. Magnus, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I have many thoughts on that question, and I think it's well framed. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that the dot-com crash left, subsea cables that served us well for a couple of decades until we need to start building more. Um, Now the question is, so I think if we're talking about AI and particularly governance of AI, two thoughts spring to mind. One is the framing I put in the beginning of, artificial general intelligence, however you define it, it may be the holy grail in a sense that everyone's working towards. And there was a nice metaphor, I guess, that was put to me the other day, which was, right now we are in a business of people wanting to make whiskey. And if you want to make whiskey, you need to start making gin because the whiskey is not going to earn you any returns for 8, 12, 15, 20 years. So what do you do in the meantime? You make gin. And I think where we are now with the chat GPTs of this world, the Geminis, etc., is the gin phase, right? And the whiskey phase will come later. But everyone's waiting, working towards getting that quality and the maturity of the product to where it needs to be. So that was a kind of convoluted way to say that I think we are still in the process of waiting for that maturity to happen. And I don't think we know I mean, it's a bit to your point about streaming, right? Back in the day, even as 2006, 2008, people were still mocking the people that were talking about streaming because multicasting or broadcasting was just so much more efficient and was going to remain the norm. No one would have seen what Netflix would evolve into and the like, right? So I think there's a similar bias that we need to acknowledge in this, in that we don't know what's coming. We don't know how it will be put to use. We don't know what the long term, the maturity of the investments that are being made now are going to turn into. And I spend a lot of time in quantum computing, for example. And I think it's a similar thing. Maybe it's, a few years delayed from where we are with AI in terms of people's understanding, but it's the same kind of thing. We have a compute technology that we just don't know what it will be capable of and what it can be used for and so on. And I think there will be lots of things that are washed out in a crash if it comes. But there will also be a lot of things that have a longer shelf life that accumulate towards something more valuable that I think will serve us a long time. So yeah, I think that's maybe a useful lens to put to it with it.
Very good. Thanks very much. So we've been talking for about 90 minutes now, and I think we'll start to wind down soon. Just looking at the things we were to discuss. One thing we haven't touched on an awful lot, I think, is that second question about how AI is reshaping how knowledge is preserved, translated, or disseminated. And I just wonder if either of you might have any thoughts on that before we move towards the end. Irina, I might start with you and see what your views on that are.
So, honestly, I did not get the exact question. Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so the question is just a general one about how AI is reshaping how knowledge is preserved, translated, and disseminated. And I think from a natural language processing perspective, there's probably quite a lot that it's reshaping there because it allows you um, to translate, for example, text more easily. Now, translation can mean from language to language, but it can also mean translation from domain to domain, maybe, or it can mean translation from application to application. It can mean translation from academic research to public knowledge. There's lots of meanings of the word translation. Just that general, the processes, I suppose, by which we store and use and share knowledge. How do you see AI changing those?
Yeah, it's very user and task dependent, in my opinion. This is what this Nature article has shown. So I'm probably a less prototypical example of an average user because I'm an expert. And what I use AI for is learning about new topics, and also AI is increasingly merged with search engines, so getting answers for questions, right? So I think that AI is generative AI is kind of facilitating the way how we interact with large information and also how we learn things about new topics. In my expert domain, I'm not using it much because the quality is not good enough for me. That's why we need human AI collaboration. But the current level is reprompting and prompt engineering. I don't have time for this. Of course, I have a lot of background knowledge and already like schemes of workflows in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
The machine translation, I still use, existing machine translation tools. I don't use AI for that. Right, but I'm not a very prototypical user. In general, AI saves a lot of knowledge in its parameters, right? But also this knowledge is not always up to date and you need to fact check a lot. So when I try to deploy the current AI in my workflow, and this is somehow aligned with what I said before, that having AI and being able to deploy it in an expert domain effectively are two different types of animals. Basically, for me, it was not very effective because the effort to verify it is very high. And also, even being a natural language processing researcher, sometimes if it summarizes my text, I cannot confidently say if it's the meaning I had in mind or if the meaning is changed. It's a very difficult expert task, right? So this is my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so limited usefulness, at least from your perspective. Magnus, what are your thoughts on that?
I take a slightly different perspective, I guess, and it goes back to some of the points we touched on already, which is data fidelity and synthetic data and the extent to which we can trust what AI is helping us develop as knowledge, right? And there's nothing wrong. I just feel that we need to take account of that drift, so that we don't end up with a reality that is somehow um, AI facilitated that is divorced from the reality that we actually live in. So I think that that needs to be absolutely taken into account of so that we don't end up, in a sense, having a sense of history, of knowledge of the world we live in that is skewed. Now, I think that there's an interesting I suppose parallel thought that entered into my mind when you were talking there, Irina. How do we how do we input? How do we use the tools that are available for in a way that's useful? I'm not particularly strong in formulating that thought, but if we are going to use AI in a good way in the next decades, um, preserving, translating, ensuring that we know, and it goes back to the trust question, right? That we know what is real and what is not, and then making sure that AI is it also knows that difference and can be used to acknowledge when something uh, is there to plug the gaps or to facilitate the understanding of something, but may not be it's been trained with in the first place.
Rena, do you want to have a go at answering that question?
So is it the question to me?
Max, do you want to repeat the question, maybe?
I think it just boils down to the idea of how we it goes back to that labeling. If we're going to have uh, a way of understanding, preserving, understanding history and understanding the world around us, and making sure that it's not synthetic in a way that AI has understood it. How do we create that framework, that labeling or metadata or system for telling reality apart from what AI has effectively plugged the gaps on.
So basically, you mean AI is like a filter to reality. Um, so this again assumes there is some objective reality. However, if you think about history, the history is represented in different ways depending on the country where you come from. Um, and I think in accepting this information or like kind of internalizing this information, the user must have transparency. What is behind this AI? How it was trained, for example, and which kind of biases it has, right? Because basically, like in the case of history, different countries have different biases. That's why same events are represented in different ways. So the same we have with different AIs. So the models are not equal in this because they've been trained on different data in different ways. And here I can imagine, like, think about the food you buy in a supermarket. You have this nutrition label with ingredients that are inside. So basically, maybe when we consume content in future, we will have this kind of ingredients label. And the point of, what is important information and how to represent it to the average user not trained in technology so the user can understand it is something to be researched in future, right? But I think this is something which I also termed AI literacy in some prior responses, right? So that something we need to teach people already in early school. Basically, when they consume the information, similarly to when they consume food, they need to pay attention to this.
I suppose there's a branch of that which is also about what data information we retain as a society. Um, I think there's a weird, strange dichotomy that we will also see playing out in AI as it evolves, which is, on the internet, everything is retained. Once you put something online, it never disappears. On the other hand, a lot of stuff online does disappear because companies go bankrupt or a company decides not to maintain a certain database or repository or whatever. So there is a certain forgetfulness whilst this notion of forever memory of the internet is there at the same time. So I do think that there's a point, and even your comments triggered that thought of how do you also decide what version of history we want to retain, what the um, collective memory should look like, and then who's in charge of that memory. Where does that memory reside? Does it need to be, we have things like Internet Archive nowadays, and various archiving resources. Is that unlike the, seed bank that's up in Svalbard? Um, to preserve genetic memory? And do we need to think of something corresponding that makes sure that we have uh, a longer term? And this was in a sense where my earlier thought about synthetic data and a parallel interpretation of the world. How do we decide? What is the governance of how we decide what history looks like and what we need to retain for the future as a record?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a completely open space, but how do we decide it for human written history? Right? We decided based on the values, on a set of values in a specific country, which is typically also reflected in the politics of that country, right? So there are some bodies in charge of that. And basically here, I think there needs to be a similar process. However, this is, as I kind of pointed out, is a global issue, right? So I see that the number of participants has gone down to 11. So is this a technical problem?
I'm not sure. Perhaps people have.
Just all of a sudden,
Okay.
it all happened like in 5 seconds while I was talking.
Maybe something drops. Maybe people just dropped off the call. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that's very strange.
Hmm. Anyway, yeah, so that raises interesting questions, I think, about AI literacy and I suppose about the role of humanities in all of this. The question of critical perspectives, external perspectives, and objectivity. Rena raised that question of whether or not there is an objective reality out there, which is something that is sometimes debated. And even if there is, I think we all perceive it through subjective lenses. And I think the challenge with AI is it enables us consciously or unconsciously to fix those lenses in ways. Human subjectivity is somewhat malleable, whereas the subjectivity of a particular generative AI tool is frozen in time, essentially. So between the fact that our audience is diminished and we've been talking for coming up on 2 hours, we might start to move towards winding down. If there is anybody in the audience, there's a little lot left. Do you have any questions or want to intervene? And feel free, please feel free to do so. But yeah, I think I've sort of led the discussion up to now, and I've been asking questions and steering the discussion as best I could. But I wonder if the panelists have questions as to things that I didn't ask, questions I didn't ask, or things that they feel are important that should be brought to the table here. Magnus, I might go to you first.
I think, I mean, I want to bring it back to the uh, lens that we're looking at it from, which is science and humanities and governance and ethics. So the main question that I would like maybe to have future sessions like this address is a little bit structurally how we resolve a lot of what we just talked about. And I think, for example, the last point about, what's this collective memory, I think leans on the scientific process and peer-reviewed publishing and humanities research accumulating and having a repository and a system for which you can have reference points on what has happened and how it should be interpreted. So I think that acknowledging and having making sure that that system remains relevant and is preserved as we go into maybe a more AI-driven future will be super important so that we keep that role that the scientific, particularly around the humanities, has. And then on the more on the I guess ethics, governance side of things, I think your question or the discussion we had around, what can we learn from internet governance? What can we learn from the way technology is managed globally? Because this is not a country by, we can't segment AI country by country, but we have to acknowledge all the cultural, political, societal differences that we have among countries. How do you square that circle? How do you create something that is acknowledges the global nature of technology, particularly AI, whilst not falling prey to these divisions or remaining relevant in spite of the global differences that we already know about. So finding that balance, learning from particularly internet governance, but also other forms of rules and norms will be really important so that we don't, as I said, I think it'll be difficult to unpick once we go down the wrong path, which is why I think sessions like this are super important to find a common ground and help evolve that governance framework, whatever it looks like, as the technology evolves at pace.
Thank you, Magnus. Irina, what did you think we should have talked about that we didn't?
So, if I recall the title of this panel correctly, it was about AI in social sciences and humanities. And I think first, we did not really go in depth about how AI is changing social sciences and humanities specifically. I mainly talked about how AI is changing my field of science, but I work in machine learning and natural language processing. And as I pointed out, there are big differences across disciplines. So this is something I would love to discuss more in future, also from my research perspective, since we would like to support the scientific process in the social sciences and humanities. And on the other hand, in various responses to the questions that we had on our agenda today, I appealed to social sciences and humanities and their important role in understanding how AI is changing the society and the future of work and their tremendous potential contribution in order to support AI-based transformation of society and science in general. So I think in future sessions we could have more focused discussions along these two perspectives.
Yes, I think that would be good. It was sort of on my mind from time to time that we weren't talking enough about social science, and it's a pity Arissa couldn't stay because she began to open that conversation at the outset. But then had, as I say, other demands on her time. Okay, so we've left some questions there to revisit in future sessions. And maybe that's a reasonably good point at which to begin to close off the discussion. So maybe just do one last sort of quick round and see for both of the panelists what was the key thing that you learned from this morning's discussion? What's the key thing that you'll take away from today? And I'll start with you, Magnus, I think.
So I mean, Irina, it was really nice to hear from an expert practitioner on the coalface of large language models and its application in the scientific field, because I don't get exposed to that enough. So that was really interesting and useful, I think, to put some precision on a lot of the questions I have and thoughts. My takeaway is, and I think it's human nature also to get quite negative and identify problems. I think one thing that I think, and Irina, I think you brought this out nicely, is that there's a lot of opportunities there. AI can be put to good use, and it is just a tool. At the end of the day, human knowledge is capricious and not always verifiable and reliable, but we do have a unique talent in developing expertise and seeing things that a machine might not. So I think reinvesting some of our faith in human nature and seeing how AI can be used to amplify and further us as experts, as smart people, was really nice. And I think that's that optimism, that positive lens of what AI can do as a tool, as an augmentation of our capabilities. I'd like to spin that forward.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Irina, what do you take away from this morning?
So I think the discussion has reinforced my own personal bias towards human AI collaboration. So I'd like to highlight this point one again, because I think this is future. Also, I'm very open to explore the use of AI as an assistant in research-based task if the quality is raised and the accountability is ensured in future. So another interesting point I think that was highlighted, that the human process is nothing but perfect, right? So it's not a perfect model, which is very often assumed in such discussions. So we need to think about these general points, how to define the quality of science, how to evaluate science in humans and machines. So in my opinion, it should not be separated, because the problem, the underlying problem, scientific quality control, is actually the same. And finally, I think there is a big, huge space related to these open points that we did not really have a clear and actionable roadmap to move ahead, related to questions such as how to bring AI literacy into education, the governance, synthetic data, and how to assess the quality of data, and what it means that in future we have ever more data. So how are we going to manage this transition to a different reality? I think there are a lot of questions in there. So how to convey this to ordinary users, the nutrition label type of metaphor that came to my mind, I think is something quite appealing to users interacting with models. Yeah, so these are the main outcomes.
Thank you very much, Irina. And I think those are good things to think about. Perhaps questions around AI literacy and how to deal with the way in which synthetic data might alter our perception of the world is something that future AI4People reports can look into. I think you're right. We need actionable roadmaps for all of these challenges, and those are things that take time and effort, I suppose, to put together. So certainly that's something that I'll feed into my report on this panel this morning, and we'll see where that goes in the future. I suppose I'll leave with my concluding thought, which is that the main insight I think I took from this morning is that there is a possibility of taking some valuable lessons from past governance of technology to see how we can better govern this technology in the future. And I think a theme running through both of your concluding contributions, I suppose, is that can be a positive thing. I think that at the moment there is a lot of concern and questions about AI and its impact and its possible negative impacts. But Irina's message is really an optimistic one of a future in which we're able to do better science more cheaply and more easily, and provided that is steered towards things that are generally for the public good. I think that can be quite a positive outcome in the long run. So maybe on that positive note, we end the conversation. So Irina and Magnus, thanks very much for giving up your time to come along for this discussion. I think it was very interesting and illuminating, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks very much.